Hi everyone, and welcome back to our IB Economics course. Today, we're going to learn about how economics got started and how it has developed through the years, from the very first big thinkers to the cutting-edge concepts of today. Think of it as a timeline of economic thought, where each era brought new insights into how our world works. The concept of economics seems obvious in today's world, since it is so closely tied to business and politics. It is constantly analyzed and discussed in the media, but it wasn't always like that. Although economics is now recognized as a science, it actually began as a philosophy. That's why many of the early contributors were philosophers instead of scientists. One such philosopher, Adam Smith, is often referred to as the father of economics. In 1776, he wrote An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or better known as simply The Wealth of Nations. Smith believed that an economy could work really well without a lot of government interference. He thought that if individuals simply acted in their own self-interest, like a butcher wanting to make money from selling meat, or a baker wanting to profit from bread, the overall result would actually benefit society as a whole.
It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest.
So people then can have food for dinner, not because they are nice people and want to make sure everyone can eat, but instead because they want to make money for themselves. Even though they sell meat and bread to benefit themselves, by acting on their own self-interest, it actually benefits society as a whole. In other words, what's good for the individual is good for the society. Smith argued that competition would regulate this self-interest. If one shoe producer raised prices too much, other producers would offer lower prices, forcing the first one to drop their prices back down, or otherwise no one would buy his shoes. This competition ensures good production and fair prices. This idea is what he called the invisible hand of markets, the idea that countless individual decisions, without government control, acts as an invisible hand that helps to guide the economy to use resources efficiently and push it to perform optimally. This led to the philosophy of laissez faire, a French term meaning let it be. In other words, just leave the economy alone, don't touch it, and it will automatically correct itself to the best possible outcome. Moving into the 19th century, other thinkers, known as classical economists, built upon Smith's ideas. An important 19th century contributor was Jean-Baptiste Say, 1767 to 1832, who developed a concept that would later be named Say's Law. This law stated that supply creates its own demand.
In a functioning economy, the act of producing goods and services inherently generates the income necessary to purchase them.
What Say meant was that because businesses paid workers to make products, the wages given to the workers would then be used to buy more products. This would increase demand, so the business would need more workers, which meant more people would have money to buy more products, and the whole cycle would feed itself. In this way, the supply of products creates the demand for products by giving people money to make the products. This is the basis for the circular flow of income model that we learned about in Unit 1.1.4. Interestingly, even though it is referred to as Say's Law, it is not scientifically accurate to think of it as a law. At the time, classical economists, influenced by Say, believed that everything produced in an economy would automatically be bought, meaning there wouldn't be long-term unemployment under normal conditions. However, as we'll see later on, this isn't always true, and Say's Law will be seriously questioned and criticized later on, leading to the development of new economic thought. Jeremy Bentham was an influential British philosopher who contributed to economics through his development of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical philosophy asserting that an action is right if it promotes the greatest happiness for the largest number of people.
The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation.
Bentham defined utility as that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness. This utility theory was then expanded by John Stuart Mill by incorporating human rights, emphasizing freedom, and opposing coercion. The concept of utility, initially central to utilitarian ethics, became a foundational concept in economics. Marginal utility. Classical economists grappled with the concept of value and price determination. The labor theory of value, which posited that a good's price was determined by the labor required to produce it, was a prominent theory. However, some economists of the day saw a very glaring problem with that theory. Imagine a person in a desert dying of thirst. How much would that person pay for a bottle of water? Probably a lot. But would they pay the same amount for a second bottle? How about a third? How about 25 bottles of water? The labor theory of value stated that each bottle of water should be equal in value since the labor required to produce each one is the same. But as we can see in reality, that's not true. So, in the late 19th century, Stanley Jevons, Karl Menger, and Leon Walras independently introduced the concept of utility to explain price determination. They agreed that utility, defined as satisfaction or pleasure from consumption, is central to value and price. Crucially, they emphasized marginal utility, which is the extra or additional benefit derived from consuming one more unit of a good. So back to our guy in the desert. That first bottle of water is very valuable because it's very useful to him. He needs it to stay alive. He'd probably pay any amount to buy it. But he then needs each additional bottle less and less. Maybe a second bottle would still be good, although he probably wouldn't need more than one to stay alive, so the price he'd be willing to pay would be much less. And anything more than 6 or 7 bottles might be too much. He wouldn't have any use for those bottles after he already quenched his thirst. In other words, he has less and less benefit for each additional bottle of water. This is declining marginal utility, and it explains why consumers are only willing to buy more if the price falls, because the value of each additional unit will drop as more and more are consumed, so the price also needs to drop. This concept was later formalized by Alfred Marshall in the law of demand, and it is why we have a downward-sloping demand curve. The concept of the margin became fundamental to understanding rational consumer behavior in microeconomics. However, not everyone agreed with the classical view. Karl Marx, a German philosopher, offered a significant critique of classical economic thought. In his book Das Kapital, Marx analyzed capitalism. He also used a version of the labor theory of value, but argued that the price of goods often exceeded the wages paid to workers. He called this difference surplus value, and he saw it as the profit made by factory owners, which he viewed as the exploitation of workers. Marx believed that capitalism was unstable and would eventually be replaced by communism due to increasing inequality and unemployment caused by competition and automation.
Driven by profit, capitalism inherently creates a struggle between the working class and the owners of capital, leading to its eventual downfall.
Basically, he believed that as technology increased, businesses would eventually replace all workers in an effort to reduce production costs and maximize profits. This would leave many people unemployed, with not enough money to buy products, causing a sharp drop in demand that would break the whole system. Let's go back to Say's law for a second. Karl Marx argued that eventually businesses would replace workers with machines to cut the costs of production. As technology improved, businesses would use more and more machines and therefore hire less workers. Because less people are working, people have less money. Because people have less money, they buy less products. Because people buy less products, businesses hire even less workers, which means even less people have money, which means even less products get bought, and so on and so on. It's essentially Say's law in reverse. Say's law said that as production increased, more workers would get more money and more people would buy more things. But that assumed people were doing the work. If machines do the work, then people don't get paid, then they don't buy things. This is taking money out of the circular flow model and eventually crashes the entire system. While his predictions didn't exactly happen as he envisioned, his work was super influential and arguably had more impact on global events than any other economic work. Whether you agree with him or not, there is no doubt that his ideas highlighted important issues like economic crises and growing income inequality. The 20th century brought huge changes, especially after major events like the Great Depression. This is where the Keynesian revolution happened. The Great Depression, with its massive unemployment and falling production, completely challenged Say's law and the idea that economies would always self-correct. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, argued that economies don't automatically return to full employment. He introduced the idea of sticky wages, meaning wages don't easily fall, which prevents the economy from fixing itself. Keynes therefore argued for government intervention. He believed that during a recession, the government should increase its spending to boost demand and get the economy going again.
Economies don't self-correct to full employment. Insufficient demand and sticky wages require government action to stimulate activity.
His ideas totally changed economic thinking, moving away from the strict laissez-faire approach and paving the way for active government management of the economy. This directly led to the rise of macroeconomic policy. Before Keynes, economists didn't really think governments needed to manage the economy at a large scale. But after Keynes, governments started using fiscal and monetary policies to try to achieve full employment and stable growth. This is why we now have macroeconomics as a distinct field from microeconomics. However, in the 1970s, the world faced a new problem called stagflation. That's when you have high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Keynesian ideas struggled to explain this. This opened the door for the monetarist and new classical counter-revolution, which rejected Keynesian economics and promoted a return to classical economics with a more laissez-faire approach, but with the addition of monetarism. Monetarism, led by Milton Friedman, emphasized the vital role of the money supply in the economy. They argued that changes in the amount of money circulating really affect prices in the long run.
Inflation is primarily caused by too much money chasing too few goods. Control the money supply to stabilize prices.
New classical economics focused on rational expectations, suggesting that people's smart predictions about policies affect how the economy behaves. Both of these schools of thought shared a common belief: markets will bring the economy back to full employment naturally, and government intervention often just gets in the way. They advocated for much less government intervention, allowing the invisible hand to work and correct the economy as needed. Now, let's fast forward to the 21st century, where economic thought is still evolving, bringing in new ideas and facing new challenges. One exciting new field is behavioral economics. This area works closely with psychology to understand how people actually make decisions, challenging the older idea that consumers are always perfectly rational. Behavioral economists use experiments and real-world evidence to show that people are often predictably irrational. Previously, economics had only listed one factor that motivated people's behavior: profit maximization. But as we know, there are many factors. Think about marketing and peer pressure that makes you buy things that you don't need or possibly even want, or using credit cards to buy things you can't afford. As we all know, consumers don't always make rational choices. And it's not all about our self-interest. As social beings, we also take into consideration the other people in our society. There's also empathy and social responsibility that plays a factor in our economic actions. This understanding helps create economic policies that can nudge people towards better choices for themselves and society. A huge development is the increasing awareness of the deep interdependence between the economy, society, and the environment. This builds on the concept of sustainability, which means maintaining resources for the future. Economists are now recognizing that we can't just look at profit in isolation. We also need to consider people and the planet. This awareness is driving a shift away from our traditional take, make, dispose linear economic model, where we extract resources, make products, and then throw them away. The goal now is to move towards a circular economy. In a circular economy, goods are designed to be repaired and kept in use for as long as possible. Products would ideally be made from materials that can safely return to nature or be fully recycled, preventing waste and pollution. It's all about maximizing the value of resources and regenerating materials at the end of their life. That's all for today's journey through economic thought. It's incredible to see how ideas have evolved over centuries, each generation building on the last, pushing us to better understand the complex world we live in. Make sure you understand the key contributions of Adam Smith, the classical microeconomics concepts like utility and the margin, and Say's law. Also, grasp Marx's critique. For the 20th century, focus on Keynes's revolution and the rise of macroeconomics, as well as the monetarist and new classical counter-revolution. Finally, for the 21st century, remember behavioral economics and the shift towards a circular economy and the interdependence of economy, society, and environment. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.